So, for those of you that don't know me, I'm Elizabeth Taylor. I'm the Chief Exec of ERSA. For the best part of 2 years, I've been working with colleagues at the DWP Data Lab, and I'm absolutely thrilled that we're doing this event this morning. I think it's really important for the sector. The evaluation of employment-related interventions and us being able to demonstrate our success, however large or small, the provision we're delivering is crucially important. And I think also the thing that the Data Lab will bring to the sector is the suitable comparison groups, so that we are comparing like with like when we're looking at what works with employment-related interventions. So I'm really pleased to have the DWP Data Lab team with us this morning. I'm hoping that at the end of this, with the insights from Matthew from IES as well, we will understand some of the things in that GDPR world around privacy notices, consent, legitimate interests, and what we can share and the whole good practice of it. So really good to have everybody here. And just to say that beyond this, ERSA is planning that we will run some future sessions on gathering evidence and evaluation to help organisations of all sizes in the sector make sure that we start gathering what we need upstream rather than that looking back evidence gathering that I think can sometimes take place. So I think we've got everybody in. I can see that we're recording. So can I hand over to you, Luke?
Yes, you may. Thank you very much. I'll start sharing my slides. Let me see if I can make it work. Can someone let me know if have they come up? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Let me see. There we go. Yes, brilliant. Okay, well, thank you very much for having me, and thanks, Elizabeth, for that intro. Just to sort of introduce myself, so I'm Luke Barclay. I'm an analyst in DWP. I'm leading on the team developing this new service called the Employment Data Lab. Just want to start by saying thank you all for joining. Really pleased to have such a good turnout. I also just want to say a big thanks to ERSA for hosting this event. And also to Matthew from IES for the following session. This sort of workshop, there's sort of two aspects to this workshop. One is just to provide a bit of information about what this new service will be, what the Data Lab is, sort of why we're interested in doing it, how we got here, and give you a bit of a flavour of what it could offer you. And because it's a service that involves data sharing, we've also got Matthew's going to do a session afterwards just to talk about some of the considerations that you'll have to come across if you wanted to participate in the Data Lab. So yeah, without further ado, I'll kick off. I should say, I mean, we've got plenty of time in this morning for questions, both sort of during the talks. If you want to have a question, do just sort of put your hand up on the chat, and we've got a couple of people looking at that, so they'll be able to prompt me if there is any questions. But also, we've got plenty of time at the end for sort of plenty of questions that might come up, so yeah, ask away. So first, I'll just so what am I going to cover in this first section? I'm going to just give you a little bit of what is the Data Lab and why are DWP sort of interested in doing it. I'll have a really high level overview of how the service will work. I've got a couple of slides to give you a sort of flavour of what you, if you were a participating organisation, could get from it. I'll let you know a little bit about where we're at in terms of the status, sort of, you know, what have we got left to do, and then I thought I'd run through the step-by-steps that you would be expected to go through if you wanted to participate, and then that will lead on to Matthew's talk next about the considerations around data sharing. Brilliant. So what is the Data Lab? So the Employment Data Lab will be a service that's provided by sort of our team within DWP, the Department for Work and Pensions, and its purpose is to carry out evaluations of it's written external employment-related interventions and share those findings back. So that's organisations, it could be charities, private organisations, anyone who works with people to help them into employment could be kind of suitable to participate. And the idea is that we will carry out the evaluations and provide an estimate of the impact that you're having on those people, and then share those findings back. And it's kind of set up in recognition that it's often really difficult for organisations to do this. Often it's difficult to get information just, on the people you work with, finding out what's happened to them, 12 months down the line, 2 years down the line is often very difficult. But also, if you're going to do an impact evaluation, you often want a suitable comparison group, which is often, getting data on the comparison group is often very difficult as well. So DWP, with its access to wide-ranging administrative data, is really well situated to address these issues. So we're in quite a good place to be able to kind of address those issues and set this service up. Is that a question coming in? Sorry, I haven't got it set up. Which method? I'll come back to the sort of methodology. Perhaps I'll keep that down, and I'll come back to that question. So, why is DWP interested in doing this? So, I mean, as you know, the Department for Work and Pensions has a number of overarching objectives, but one of them is to help people into and to progress in work. And by setting up this data lab service, what we're essentially doing is improving the evidence base on what works in helping people into employment. So it's really aligned to what we want to achieve. Perhaps the learnings could help us improve our DWP programs, but also in helping you understand what's really working, what's not, is also very much aligned to our objective. So it's completely aligned to what we want to do as a department. More broadly, it's a positive use of a public asset. So by that I mean the data, DWP data, but it's all of our data, and it's consistent with the principles of open government. And also, just internally, impact evaluation is something the department does and is interested in doing. So by setting up a sort of dedicated team, it's an opportunity for us to kind of improve and streamline our processes. So lots of benefits. How have we got here? What's the sort of history? So there's quite a long history to the Employment Data Lab. As many people who've been involved in it will know, it's been going along for quite some time. I've started here sort of referencing the Ministry of Justice, and they set up their Justice Data Lab back up, I think it was in 2013. Very similar setup to what we're hoping to do, or we're aiming to do. But in their case, they're aiming to evaluate programs that help people like offenders and looking at impacts on reoffending rates. And that's had a great deal of success over the years. And that success basically led to questions, about why, can we do this in the employment space? And there were lots of approaches to ministers over the years and the Secretary of State, particularly from sort of representatives on this call from, MPC and ERSA and other organisations have been quite instrumental in sort of focusing on this and getting this off the ground. After those sort of approaches, we've had a number of feasibility studies were undertaken within the department, between 2016 and 2018, to sort of understand whether or not the service was likely to be possible. And then we got ministerial approval to set up the team that I'm in now. Back in the spring of 2019, and the team was actually set up over the summer, and we've essentially been working on it ever since. So sort of just over 2 years, but we've had quite a few interruptions, most notably due to COVID, where had to focus on a few other things for a while, but yeah, back on track now. Really quick stuff, just quick one on like how we've set it up as we set up the team and we built a project structure around it, and I just want to sort of highlight a few elements of that. One of the things we really wanted to focus on is analytical assurance, so quality assurance, making sure that the outcomes and the outputs of this service are sort of robust and fit for purpose. And so we sort of built up a lot of whilst it's a small working group within DWP, we've brought in a lot of expertise from both within DWP and externally. And we're really pleased to have the Institute for Employment Studies supporting us and guiding us on this, just to make sure, help us ensure that we're using the most up-to-date techniques and etc. So yeah, big thanks to them. And the other element I wanted to just focus is, it's really important that we set this service up that, once it's in place, we want the service to meet the needs of the users. And so we set up an advisory panel of external organizations to help us ensure that the service is going to meet the needs and be useful for the user organization. So you can see some of the organizations we've had on there, and a big thanks to all of those who've been participating over these last few years and before that to get this off the ground. Been really helpful in helping us reach, for example, ERSA today, helping us reach all of you lot, and we've done surveys over the years and held interviews with user organizations, all of which would have been a lot more difficult if we hadn't had this group supporting us. So that's a bit of the sort of what it is and why are we interested in doing it. So I've got a few slides now just to sort of summarize in a high level way how it will work. I can see a question. So how big is the Data Lab team? So the Data Lab team at its core there's 3 of us, so small, but as I said, we've actually brought in we're making use of a lot of expertise both within the department and externally. So it's more than just the 3 of us, but there are, on paper it's 3. So how the service will work. So essentially it kicks off with an external organization who are interested in using the Data Lab. Once there's a bit of stuff at the beginning where we just need to establish that it's right, and you go through some data protection and steps beforehand. But essentially it kicks off with the user organization sending in identifiable information about participants of an intervention that they want to evaluate. So this is identifiable information. It's things like names, addresses, date of births, anything that will be useful for us to try and find those people within our data sets. So that's what happens next. Once the data's been brought into DWP, the identifiable data are then used to find those participants within DWP's data sets. And once they've been found, we can then link them to all the available administrative data that we have within DWP. A point here I haven't kind of explicitly stated on here, but I think it's important to draw out that matching, that linking to DWP's data set is actually done by a different team to the Data Lab for sort of data protection purposes. So that team will do the linking, and then they strip the data of all the explicit identifiers, so like name and address, and then sort of replace it with sort of a code, and then we use that in the Data Lab team. So in the Data Lab team, we would never see the names and addresses of the people you worked with. What they do. So once we have that data, we then
Luke, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
You're breaking up quite a bit.
Oh, am I? Oh, that's annoying. I wonder if I can get it to phone. Sometimes you can get it to phone. Is it really?
It was just then. It's intermittent, but just to let you know, it may help if everyone turn their videos off while you're talking.
Let me see if I can get it to. I'm going to get it to call me. Can I do that?
I think just carry on for now.
Do you think? Should I try?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for that, Chris. And if it continues, shout again, because it's important you can hear. So once we in the Data Lab team have received that data, and we can, of those matched participants, we can link it to all the available administrative data that we have within the department. and build up a picture of what that treatment group looks like. And then with that data, we can then build a comparison group of similar individuals who did not participate. And then what we're able to do then is compare the outcomes of each of those two groups, so the treated group and the comparison group, and then provide an estimate of the impact impact of the treatment. Then the results are reviewed and discussed, and we'd be really keen to involve the user organisation in this to ensure that we're sort of understanding it right and presenting it appropriately. And then once that's all done and all the sign-off processes have been gone through, we could then just send, a report back to yourselves so that you can learn and have an assessment of the impact. Really key point just to flag is that only aggregate level non-identifiable information will ever be shared back. So you'll never find out, oh, Jane Smith finally did get a job or not. It would always be aggregate information. So you'd find out, so 60% of your treated group were in employment after 6 or 12 months, that kind of thing. I'll explain. I'll give you hopefully these next few slides will just give you a little bit more of a flavour of what you could expect to get back. So basically, at the end of this process, you'll get a report back detailing sort of the labour market outcomes of the people who were treated compared to a similar comparison group who were not treated, and importantly, that will include an estimate of the impact of that the intervention has had. Here's a snapshot of what it sort of currently looks like, but as I'll come to, we're still sort of formulating exactly what the report might look like, so that will change. We sort of use lots of data. As I mentioned, we have access to a wide-ranging sort of a lot of administrative data that we'll use sort of in the analysis, and we can present a lot of that back to yourselves as part of the report. So on the left-hand side, these are just some of the variables that we might use in assessing, to build this comparison group, and sharing that, back with yourselves would be interesting. So we can give sort of breakdowns, sort of straightforward things like age, but we'll also look for things like sort of disability markers, whether or not they're lone parents. We're building up a picture of the type of people, what does the treatment group look like? And we also have access to a large range of benefits and employment information. So, we can focus in on, what benefits were they receiving at the time of starting the intervention, how many days on each benefit did they have in the years prior to starting the intervention. And we can also track this over quite long periods of time. So on the right-hand side shows some, analysis that we could sort of share with yourselves, which is, in this case, we've split someone's labour market sort of status into 4 categories. I haven't stated what they are explicitly here, but in this case, category 3 is someone being employed. Category 1 and 2 are in out of work benefits of various types, and category 4 is sort of not in work and not in benefits. And so we can show, this is the kind of information we can share back with you, give you an idea of who are the people that you're working with and what happened to them over kind of long periods of time. So in this case, it was looking at them. These are weeks along the bottom, so it's essentially 2 years before they started the intervention and then the 2 years after the intervention. Really important, the really interesting stuff is the impact information, so that comparison between the treated group and the comparison group, sorry. And so we can provide you with information on that. So in this case, I've just taken some snapshots of various sort of analyses that we might have done in the past. So, a typical thing we might be able to, look at is, the impact on employment. And so in this case, the treated group spent an average of 100 days in employment in the 2 years after starting the programme, and that compares to 58 days for the comparison group. And we can give you an indication to say whether or not that difference was statistically significant or not. I was just reading the top left box there, and that's essentially a sort of verbal way of showing what's on the graph to the right, where there you've got like the number of days in employment sort of in the 1 and then 2 years after the intervention start for the treated in light blue and the comparison group in dark blue. And you can see that the treated group consistently spent more time in employment than the comparison group. And we'd hope to be able to sort of, it's possible that we might be able to dig into this a little bit further, and the Sankey diagram, it's called, at the bottom, sort of looks at transitions. So we've split people into these various categories, and we look at what category they were at the program start and what category they were at 2 years later, and we can see, okay, the increase in employment, which is category 3, has been driven by people flowing from various benefit types and things. So yeah, and this can be really interesting if it's not always, if you're looking at outcomes like in or out of employment, that's great, but moving towards, perhaps moving from one benefit type to another benefit type might show progression towards the labour market, which would also be a positive outcome measure. And so there are, there's quite a lot we'd hope to be able to offer you. And we can also look at, whether or not the impacts are sustained over time. So in this is a plot showing the proportion. It's actually the percentage point difference between the proportions of the comparison group and the treated group who are in employment. So you can see, and it starts 2 years before the intervention. The 0 is when the participants started, and then you've got 2 years after. And you can see the impact is 0 for the first 2 years, and that's almost by design, because we matched them together, the treated and comparison group, saying there's no difference between the proportions of the group who are in employment. But in the following 2 years, you can see there's the treated group have a sustained larger proportion in employment, showing a sort of sustained positive impact. And you've got the shaded area, the confidence interval, so you can have some confidence to say there's a significant increase in employment and it's sustained over 2 years. Just to sort of manage expectations a little bit, it's not always possible to do this full impact evaluation. Sometimes, for example, the sample sizes might be too small to be able to get meaningful data, or perhaps the intervention is targeted at a group of people for whom we just don't have good enough data to sort of reliably create a comparison pool. So it just might not be possible to do that full impact evaluation. In those cases, we would still be keen and hopeful that we could offer you something that would be quite beneficial. And what that would be, instead of the impact information where you create a comparison group and do that comparison, we would simply just give you information about the people you worked with. So what happened to them 6 months down the line, 12 months down the line, 2 years down the line, but also information about what was the makeup, who were the people you worked with, which I understand can often be, useful information as well, like how long did they spend on benefits before working with you and things like that. Yeah, so sort of 2 levels of output. The most powerful is the sort of impact evaluation, but where that's not possible, I think we can still offer you something beneficial. So that's that. A couple of slides now on just where we're at, what status are we at with the development. We are still in development, but we're very much heading towards the end of the development phase, you'll be pleased to know. The code and the processes and the techniques have all largely been defined. We have data sharing arrangements in place with HMRC and the Department for Education, and we're in the process of developing one with the Ministry of Justice. So this allows us at the moment to, we can report on employment outcomes, we can report on educational outcomes, and we can also, of course, report on sort of all the benefits outcomes and things. And then Ministry of Justice information will be a little bit further down the line. We've established our sort of data sharing processes and documentation, and that's all largely in place. So the kind of full process is there. There is still work to do. We've got to do quite a bit of quality assurance just to make sure that our processes are robust. We're making sure that we're using the right data, and we're sort of cleaning it and deriving the variables appropriately, and that there is a bit of work to do there. We're also still finalizing precisely how we want to report the results and how that should be presented, and then also the sort of broader documentation, sort of user documentation, all sorts of other document, and a methodology report that we want to have alongside the launch. And we also, just because we haven't got there yet, we just need to test the sort of the dissemination and sign-off processes and the publication strategy. So that's all, yeah, still to be done. I'm not going to put an explicit date for you exactly, it will be ready by this date, but I want to sort of emphasize, whilst we're still in development now, we would really be, if you're interested, we'd really like to hear from you now. We're actively looking for organisations to sort of participate in the development phase as we move towards a live service. So, you know, yeah, we can work with you now. It's not a finished, absolutely polished live service right now, but we can still get underway and start cracking on with the analysis. So if you are interested, please do get in contact. That's our website, employment.datalab@dwp.gov.uk. So I'm nearing the end of this my first section. I'm just going to end with a sort of the step-by-steps, or if you do want to participate, what would you expect? What would be expected of you, and what would you have to do? So there's a few sort of step-by-steps that I'll just talk you through. So the first thing to do is simply, as I mentioned, contact the Data Lab team, and that will kick off discussions about using the service. We'll be asking you about kind of finding out about your intervention. You know, when did it take place? That's one thing I probably should have emphasized earlier. This is very much a retrospective evaluation, so we can't evaluate a service that's only recently kicked off. We need to, enough time has to have elapsed for us to be able to sort of see those outcomes. So yeah, we'll be discussing things like that, and you know, who are you working with, and just establishing that it's right for you. Once we've gone through that stage, we would then send through to you, you know, some data sharing information detailing on how we would process the information once we receive it. And we can also share with you our data protection impact assessment, things like that. It'll be your job then to sort of review that and confirm that you have the lawful basis to participate in this service and to transfer your data to us for this purpose. So and we'll also need you to sort of just state what that lawful basis is. And so this section, Matthew will be able to we'll talk a bit more about the considerations that are involved in this section, this part later. Then before we just do the transfer, we'll just need there's a few bureaucratic steps we have to go through. So we just need to get some of the details of what you're going to send through to us. So the names of the variables, how many records you might send through. And we also, just for later on in the analysis, there's some information we need about the intervention. So, you know, what is the intervention? What are the eligibility criteria? And what are the expected outcomes? And when would you expect to see those outcomes? Are you interested in sort of 6 months after the treatment starting, or 2 years after the treatment starting? And those are the kind of things we'd like to pin down. Then we just need to decide on the method of transfer. How is the data actually going to be sent into us? Typically, so far, it's been sort of through one of two methods, which is one, an encrypted memory stick, which we would arrange to be couriered to your kind of either place of work, or, you know, if you're working from home, we can pick it up there. Then it would be, you would have to upload it onto the memory stick, and then the courier would take it back securely. Or if you've got sort of those various options around encrypted email that we could work with as well. And simply, we just need to do that, transfer the data via the selected method. We in the Data Lab team will make sure to keep you updated and confirm exactly, you know, once we've received it successfully. And then it's this sort of, it's the data's with us, and we'll get underway with the analysis. Whilst we're doing the analysis, it might be necessary for us to get in contact with yourselves a number of times just to check our understandings. Perhaps some of the results look unusual, that we might want to check, are we understanding this right, that kind of thing. And then also, once we sort of move towards the results, we'd like to be able to discuss them and discuss the interpretation of them with yourselves. And then once all of that's all done, and we've gone through the sign-off process in our end, then simply just await the report, and you should receive that. I should mention our longer term ambition is that the reports will be available on gov.uk, but that's something we haven't yet fully worked through now, and so it's not currently an obligation at the moment. That's it. It's the last slide now. Just a reminder that whilst we are still in development, we are very much keen to hear from you if you're interested now. So please do just drop us a line if you're interested, and we can kick off the discussion.
Okay, thank you, Luke. I'm sure if you've had your eyes on the chat that you'll see that we've been getting questions since about 9 minutes past 10. So Do you want to just take a look at those with your colleagues and respond to them? We did have a hand raise that then went down, so let's take the questions in the chat first and then see if anybody else wants to come in. So do you have good access to those, Luke? Yeah?
Yes, yeah. I can look at them now. So I'll run through them now and try and answer them if I can. So one from Michael, would methodologies such as social return on investment be used? I should have sort of mentioned with this. So there's a lot of things we could do and would like to be able to do with the data lab. Yeah, I sort of, the following question was, how big is the data lab team? As I mentioned, it's a small team. So we are limited in resource. And I think one of the approaches we've taken is we're going to keep it as a minimum viable product approach at the moment. So we're trying to set something up that's sufficient, and then once that service is set up, look at all the added extras that we could add on, and doing things like return on investment and cost benefit analysis, and looking at different outcome measures. For the time being, we're mainly just focusing on some fairly simple, but we think quite powerful outcome measures about simply wills, how many of the group were in employment, or how many days did they spend in employment, and then also looking at how many days they were on or off benefits, and then also with the educational outcomes we can incorporate some educational outcomes at the moment. So I think at the moment the answer is it's not currently included, but so certainly interesting for the future, I think. Do jump in again if I haven't answered your question properly. Next one. Would the project cover interventions for those who are not registered with the DWP, e.g. not claiming benefits? What about supporting people who already have a job into different types of employment? Again, brilliant question. So first of all, there's no requirement for people to be registered with DWP or receiving benefits at the time. Certainly not. One of the things that it does throw up questions about whether or not how good our data would be on them, and that's something we've yet to explore. So certain groups of people we just might not have fantastic data on, which might sort of limit the offer we could give back. And then supporting people who already have a job in sort of progressing within work is something we're really interested in. But again, that falls back into my sort of minimum viable product approach at the moment. We're not really looking at in-work progression, or I mean, it's certainly next on our list. So looking at sort of earnings outcomes, and we can look at different employment sectors and things. That is all possible. It's just not, it's a little way off at the moment. Do we need consent of the candidates before we pass details onto the data lab? Really good question, and this is one that will be covered in the next section. So this is what comes down to: you have to decide that you have the lawful basis under the current legislation to participate. And there are lots of different ways of doing it. It doesn't just rely on consent. I'll leave that for Matthew to pick up in the next section. Can you reiterate what those identifier fields are, please? I think. Oh yeah. So
I've covered a lot. Luke,
have you covered that one?
Yeah, I think I'll go through and pick up the questions that I haven't replied to, or the more interesting ones. There's a question around how long the end-to-end process is likely to be for producing, well, for the whole project, and also questions are linked to that, if you can answer both at once. Questions around, would we revisit this 6, 12, 18 months down the line after interventions, etc. So maybe see if you can cover off the timescales and when is an appropriate time to run this.
Yeah, okay, brilliant. So the timescales one's a bit tricky to answer at the moment, just because we're very much in the development phase. We're still, it's not like we've got the service absolutely established and we're just churning them through. I think we would, and our hope would be that once the service is fully set up and we're not kind of developing at the same time as doing the analysis, then it would be, of the order of, a couple of months from end to end. Yeah, there are a couple of things. Some of the steps do take a little while. So I mean, at the moment, I think if you were joined now, expect it to be more than, it's going to be sort of, a good number of months if we were to do it now whilst we're developing. So yeah, so sorry, I can't be that precise now. Hopefully we'll be able to have that pinned down soon. What was the last?
A question around when would we do this, and would we expect to revisit analysis 6 months, 12 months, 18 months later?
So I mentioned it's a retrospective service, so it does require sort of quite a bit of time to have elapsed. You know, you need a sort of sufficient number of people to have gone through, and then some time to have elapsed so that we could see the data. And it's not simply the data has to then, there's a bit of a lag sometimes with the data coming in, so it can take a couple of months. You know, if you waited a year, we might have to wait another couple of months just so that we actually have a whole year's worth of data. I think unless you've got very specific outcomes that are on shorter timescales, I'd imagine a year is probably, you'd probably want to have a year's follow-up, you know, to see the impacts. It's possible that we could revisit, you know, if we had your data on file, we could just rerun the analysis a year, 2 years, 3 years down the line. Again, we're not entirely sure how, you know, how many people we're going to have queued up to do this. I mean, if we've got fewer people, I think we'd have more scope to be able to do that kind of thing and revisit ones we've done before. If, you know, if we've got inundated with people and backlogs, then you probably just have to join the queue and we'd get to it again and we could run it through again. But certainly, it's certainly something we'd be interested in doing, and seeing, you know, looking at these longer term effects, even beyond 2 years for some of these programs would be really interesting.
I think just to add data retention would be a consideration there as well. So it might make more sense to delete the data and revisit, but again, something to consider. I'm going to read out this question from Mark Laws. Great question, and let you consider this if you haven't read it, Luke. A system you've described doesn't reference distance travelled measured. If you plan to map social and emotional development, which leads to the removal of barriers to employment, how do you intend to do this?
So this is the sort of progression towards employment, I think, if that's right. Yeah. So I mean, again, there's an element of sort of my get out is to a certain extent, you know, we're focusing on a small number of, I think, quite powerful outcome measures, but not always perfect. However, there are things we can do to look at distance travelled, and certainly, like, you know, in a relatively naively, you can look at the kind of different types of benefits that people might be on and receiving. I think also, I mean, one thing I will say is that we are kind of fully aware that I think this is going to be a really, really powerful tool for many organizations, but it's never going to fully define everything that an organization does. And so I think we're quite respectful of the fact that, you know, this is just one aspect of it and it won't capture everything you do. And we're so aware that there are a lot of organizations out there that work, you know, have a huge positive impact, but, you know, at the end of it, the person might not quite be in that job or whatever it is, and they wouldn't show up. And that, and you know, that we understand that, and I think that will be something we're kind of keen to kind of try and sort of recognise in the write-up of the reports as well.
A couple more questions, Luke. Would we be able to provide support and statistical outputs? And I assume the answer is yes. If you're doing the analysis, you can provide those thresholds, confidence intervals, etc., as part of that feedback.
Which question was that again? Would we, as in, would we help with?
So if we're providing analysis, would we, for example, provide confidence intervals around the analysis, either in the report or back to the customer?
So this is actually one of the things we're focusing on a lot at the moment. It's just about the presentation of the analysis and how we we report it. So we would endeavour to give you an indication of the confidence we have in the outcomes. And one of the things we're really keen to do is kind of give you some sort of steer on what it, you know, how to interpret it. So kind of one of the things we're thinking about including a sort of like boxes, and we're actually taking a bit of a lead from the Ministry of Justice, who have done this really well, which is kind of give you a sort of steer on what you can say about the analysis and what you can't say about the analysis, and just to make it really explicit what, you know, what it does show, and what you can and can't say.
Just a request for Adam Rain, if you're on the call, if you can just post the Data Lab email address in the chat. I think it's on the slides as well, which I'm sure will be circulated, but we can put in the chat as well. And then there's a question around the Nomatches and what we do around that. So I think there's something for us to consider there, Luke, in terms of what we do around non-matches, in terms of analysing biased, etc. Certainly, we obviously won't be providing details, individual level details back on non-matches. But what we will have is we'll have the data, the full cohort of information that comes into DWP, so we can certainly look at the matches versus the non-matches and the data that you supply and see whether there's any differences there in terms of whether our analysis is then going to be onward biased by the level of, and who the non-matches are. But yeah, certainly we can provide indicators around match rate as well, and would make sure that the match rate was sufficient to be able to take this forward. Which also then reminds me, Luke, of another question asked earlier on. What's a suitable sample size to be able to take this forward?
Again, interesting, really good question. It hasn't fully been defined, but I imagine, I feel like anything much below 100 and we probably wouldn't stand, it depends on the size of the impact you might have. But, my feeling is around, a few hundred would be, is the kind of, is probably, I think if you've got smaller, please get in contact and we can work it out and we can try it at this stage. We haven't done the full, we'd like to explore that. But, I feel like we'd be more comfortable we get sort of statistically significant results in the kind of, around 300, 400, 500 would be great. But if, we're very happy to consider and look at what we can do below that.
Another question. You maybe have caught up on these now. Hopefully, and for everyone else's benefit, I know I've replied to some as we've been going along and we've covered them. If you think your question hasn't been covered, just for the sake of keeping it up to date, just repost your comment in the chat, just so it's at the bottom of the list so we can see it. Do you also track the transition for disabled students from higher education into employment? I think I've got some thoughts on that as well, and I can pass over to you. But I think there's a question of, I think it depends on what the intervention yourselves are looking at. Obviously, as departments, DWP and DFE would consider the transition more generally of disabled students from higher education into employment. But I think for me, it depends what it is you're looking at. And if, for example, it's a specific intervention around disabled students, then clearly that's got to be a factor in terms of our analysis and our control group. Luke, do you want to add any further comment to that?
No, that's it. Just yeah. I mean, I think we've yet to kind of fully explore the full richness of the DFE data that we've got through, but I'm pretty confident that those flags for disability and various other indicators are in there, and they would certainly, if you're focused on an intervention targeted at disability, then that should be something we could control for, I think.
Oh, there's one question just coming back to me. I'll have to find it. It was around looking at the DWP Youth Offer. It's not something that I think is on your radar, is it, Luke? But I'll just see if I can find the question. Oh, there we go, from Mark again. Has an evaluation been set up for the DWP Youth Hub National Initiative? If so, it would be useful to hear what this looks like.
Again, yeah, it's not something I'm specifically sort of tuned into. This service is aimed predominantly at people who are not, it's not, interventions that are kind of funded or kind of done in collaboration with DWP, because, DWP, there's other avenues that those organizations and that those interventions will have to evaluate their work. So this is more aimed at, external organizations that don't, or not kind of co-funded or co-delivered by DWP. So it's not something we're not in, I'm not working on the Youth Hub initiative at the moment.
And I think that goes for other initiatives within the department as well, such as the youth employment initiatives, etc., which are being run by other teams within DWP, although Luke's team is aligned with those teams to make sure that we're looking at common methodologies, etc. And then, speaking of which, question from Max: when choosing the comparison groups, what variables do we use?
So it's a range of variables, and it kind of depends on the intervention in question. So I didn't really go into the sort of analysis that we do, but we use a technique called propensity score matching. And the idea behind that is you want to basically be able to control for sort of essentially all the variables and factors that might plausibly impact someone's participation, and then also the outcomes that you're interested in evaluating. So I mean, yeah, like, the things that we focus on at the moment, and the things that we have good data on are like, building up a big picture of their sort of labour market history. So whether or not they're in employment, and on what benefits over the years in the run up. We also have sort of, flags around, disability flags and lone parent flags, and whether or not they've got dependent children or not. If it was one that was targeted at young people, we would use the DFE data to include things like eligibility for free school meals, what their educational outcomes were at various stages, and that kind of thing. So there's a range of control variables that we would look at, and we would tailor it, to the intervention, and we have to make an assessment. Have we got sufficient data? And if in cases where we think we're not really able to control effectively, we'd have to just make the call that we can't do the impact evaluation in those situations.
A two-part question this time, Luke. Can we share a sample report, and what do the parameters of the input data set look like?
So I can look at getting. We're sort of I mentioned sort of we're in the process of finalising and drafting what the reports are going to look like. So I probably wouldn't want to share it right now, but it's certainly something that we can share. We'd probably, I could sort of send you a sort of mock-up of one, certainly in due course, and then obviously, hopefully, when we've actually got some ones going through the process, if I mentioned we're not mandating that they'll all be published at the moment, but hopefully some of these will be available more publicly, and it will be something you could see. And then in terms of the data input file, so we have those variables defined. I mean, we have a form that can certainly, if you're interested, get in touch, and we'll just send you what you would need to fill out. And it's just a sort of pro forma template of what variables we need, and it's largely in discussion. We might tailor what variables are required depending on your intervention and depending on the analysis that you want. If you want to break down, have a look, compare the impacts of two interventions that you run, we'll need an extra indicator to let us know which, to be able to do the breakdown that you want. So kind of, it's a sort of, there's things that are fairly generic, and then there's things that will be quite bespoke, and that's what we can have a discussion about when you get in contact.
So there was a former question as well, which I think I skipped over, around securely transferring data. So the answer to that is we've got different options available for how you would transfer the data to us, which includes at the moment us issuing you with an encrypted USB stick, which would be transferred to you and transferred back to the department via secure courier. Or we have options which we can look at, such as PGP email, depending on file size. The department's also got secure transfer your file type solutions, but again, it depends how much of those need to be bespoke and set up for different organisations versus how much are fairly easy. What we don't have yet is a sort of simple Dropbox kind of solution. That I think the MOJ has got a dedicated secure email for this as well. But yeah, we'll get into that and discuss it with each organisation. It depends what worked for them and what worked for us. But we do have means of securely transferring data. Question I'll pass to you, Luke. Can I just clarify, this service would not just be for past DWP funded programmes where evaluations have may already taken place? I mean, I can answer that, but I'll let you answer that.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's specifically not for those basically. So it's new organisations, people who have not, you don't have to have been in touch or funded by DWP in any way. I mean, this is external organisations who are otherwise, wouldn't have access to DWP data and things like that. So yeah.
And it's free. I think is the guy. I assume that must have come across, but yes, it's a free service we're offering.
Should have made that clearer. Yeah, should have.
Yeah, and I think for future, just getting slightly ahead of ourselves. But clearly, this is something DWP are going to continually evaluate. We'll evaluate the need for this service. We'll work with ministers. I know ERSA and others are in touch with ministers on a regular basis. And if demand outstrips what we can cater for, then obviously we'll be able to look at the size of the team, what resource we put behind this, and if necessary, make a case to increase the size of that team as well. So because it's a free service, obviously we've got to consider how much we can offer and how much resource we put behind this. So don't worry too much about the size of the team at the moment. There's no more questions yet. About maybe thought there and pass over. Sorry, I've taken a roll of the chair here, and I think that's
you've done a great job. Okay, shall I pick up again? And of course, people can continue to put questions in the chat. I did notice that there was one question for me. I was asked about the work that is being done by the REACT partnership, and perhaps I can just explain for the benefit of everyone on the call. 6 of the contract holders of Restart have joined together as something called the REACT partnership, and the REACT partnership will do a series of sort of evaluation around evidence, the impact and learning and things that we are realizing and developing as Restart is delivered. So that work isn't retrospective, it's in real time, and the beginning of it is happening now with some action learning sets that are being facilitated by the IEP. The Institute for Employment Studies will be doing the research and evaluation. It's basically owned by the 6 primes that have signed up to that piece of collaboration. I don't think there's an overlap with what the Data Lab are doing, and there will in the future be a retrospective piece of work done on Restart, I believe, by the Learning and Work Institute. So there'll be lots going on in that space, but the REACT partnership is very different to this. Would be very happy to set up a call with me and Tony from the IES if anybody wants to talk about the work that we'll be doing through REACT. Anyway, with no further delay from me, can we move on to Matthew Williams from IES, who's going to talk us through the sort of implications of GDPR and research and sharing data. Okay, Matthew.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Very happy to be here and talk through the sort of data protection considerations regarding this. Just a bit of background about myself. I'm a senior research fellow at IES. Do a lot of work in our policy area generally around labour market analysis, but particularly focus on impact evaluations for widening participation programmes for HE students. But colleagues of mine are very involved in process and impact evaluations of employment-related support activities. We're often are engaged by DWP and other government departments to run evaluations of programmes that they've funded or co-funded. But obviously this service is aimed at those organisations who perhaps don't have the budget to commission a full-scale evaluation, but want to find out what's happened with their participants. So bear with me while I just try to share the slides.
Yeah,
right. Okay, so start the slideshow. Right. So yeah, this is sort of discussion and presentation of some of the data protection considerations regarding using the Data Lab. So just go straight into things. So this is based on the slide that Luke presented earlier, which sort of summarises the process that users of the Data Lab will go through. So they'll send personal details of their participants through to the data lab. So the details that you need to send, ideally name, address, date of birth, are personal data according to the Data Protection Act, GDPR. And so their processing needs to be done in line with the legislation. The data lab, as part of the process of working with you, also want confirmation of that you've identified a lawful basis for the purposes of transferring the data. So name, address, date of birth are generally the minimum. It may be helpful if you're able to provide other data such as national insurance number, gender, email, telephone number, which can assist with the matching process and hopefully increase the size of the matched population that you have. So just to sort of cover some definitional issues. So personal data are defined in the Data Protection Act as information relating to natural persons who can be identified or who are identifiable directly from the information in question or indirectly identified from that information in combination with other information. So you'll be handing over names, addresses, dates of birth. So that is clearly personal information. You can identify individuals if you know that information about them. Within the sphere of personal data, there's also certain data identified as special category data. And also, it may be appropriate for your purposes to, you may have provided services to ex-offenders, or it may be that you would be dealing with information related to criminal conviction offences data. So just to highlight that these are considered more sensitive than other data, and they may only be processed in more limited circumstances or with additional consideration applied to them. But just to highlight that the outputs that you get from the data lab would be in aggregated form, so in tables, figures, aggregated with, so all of the individuals you've worked with are presented, the data is presented in aggregated form, so you wouldn't get any results back about any individuals. And so in that sense, the results would not constitute personal data, and there's no data protection considerations around receiving the results. So special category data, there's a number of categories of special category data. So they're listed here. So data about racial or ethnic origin, data on political opinions, on religious or philosophical beliefs, trade union membership, genetic data, biometric data, data concerning health, data concerning a person's sex life, and data concerning a person's sexual orientation. Now, to process any of those types of data, you need to identify an additional purpose for processing those data on top of the lawful basis that you've identified for general processing of the data belonging to the data subjects that you work with. Now, it may not be that there may be no need for any processing of these types of special category information in using the data lab. If you're only providing name, address, date of birth, then that doesn't fall into special category data. The data lab themselves may use some of these types of data in their matching processes, but as Luke described in the process, the data lab team will be doing that on anonymized data because they have all of the identifiable information stripped out and just a sort of pseudonymous ID number that they can relate back to the other teams within DWP. So their processing would not be considered to be on personal data because it's been anonymized, and then they may match on health, for example, disability status or not, or on ethnicity. But just to highlight again that if you are working with ex-offenders or the data you collect about your participants includes information on criminal convictions, you just need to be aware that there is extra protection within data protection regarding those data, and that you need to pay attention to that and ensure that any processing of those types of data are in accordance with the specific regulations that apply to those, but I'm not going to go into detail on those here. So in terms of processing data, the GDPR sets out 7 key principles that apply to processing of the data, personal data belonging to data subjects. So there's lawfulness, fairness and transparency, purpose limitation. I'll describe those first 2 in a bit more detail on the next slide. There's the principles around data minimization, so only processing the minimum amount of data you need for the purposes of your processing. Accuracy, you need to keep the data accurate and update it if it's found to be inaccurate. Storage limitations, only keeping the data for as long as necessary. Integrity and confidentiality, which relates to security and only giving access to the data to people who need it. And accountability, setting out what you'll do and being held accountable for the uses that you do make of the data. So processing of personal data for the data lab is in line with any other processing, needs to follow these principles. But to point out, organisations are likely to be following them already in how the data have been collected in the first place for the purposes of providing the employment-related support to the individuals that you're working with. So just to provide a bit more detail on the first two principles, which are the sort of key ones covering the likely use of the data for the data lab. So the first is lawfulness, fairness and transparency. So you must identify valid grounds under the GDPR, known as the lawful basis, for collecting and using the personal data. You must ensure that you do not do anything with the data that's in breach of any other laws. You must use personal data in a way that is fair. So it means you must not process the data in a way that's unduly detrimental, unexpected, or misleading to the individuals concerned. And you must be clear, open and honest with people from the start about how you will use their data. The purpose limitation principles is, very closely aligned with fairness and transparency. You must be clear about what your purposes for processing are from the start. You need to record your purposes as part of your documentation obligations and specify them in your privacy information for individuals. And you can only use the personal data for a new purpose if either this is compatible with your original purpose, you get consent, or you have a clear obligation or function set out in law. So these principles, in essence, this is what advisors at ICO have sort of said in everyday language. It's just making sure what you do with the data is lawful. You've told people what you'll do with their data, and then you don't do anything else with it that they wouldn't expect. So the first step of these is identifying a lawful basis for processing. So you must have a valid lawful basis in order to process personal data. So there are 6 lawful bases for processing set out in Data Protection Act, GDPR. So you need to be using one of these for the processing of any personal data. So public task is one. So if you're a public authority, public organisation, it's likely that this will be your basis. There's legitimate interests of the data controller. There's consent, i.e. the individual has provided consent to the processing. Now, these 3 are going to be the ones that are most likely to apply to the organisations attending today. But there are also bases of contract, so where an individual signed a contract with you for services, a legal obligation, and vital interests. It's necessary to protect the health and vital interests of data subjects. Now, no single basis is better or more important than the others in law. The purpose of the processing and the relationship that the data controller has with the data subject, with the individual, will determine which is the most appropriate lawful basis for the type of processing that is carried out. And again, just to reiterate, you're likely to already have identified an appropriate basis for processing for the operation of your program activity. So in providing the services, you'll be needing to collect data from individuals, and you already will have specified a lawful basis for processing, which is one of the 6 available. So just a bit more detail on the 3 which are most likely to apply to participants here today. So public interest, and this is defined as processing is necessary for the performance of a task carried out in the public interest or in the exercise of an official authority vested in the controller. So this lawful basis is likely to be appropriate for local authorities, and I know we've got county councils, local authorities represented today, but this won't apply to charities, third sector organisations, or even private organisations. This lawful basis kind of reassures that personal data is being used for the public good by public authorities whose raison d'etre is to help the public. The second of the 3 that are likely to apply is legitimate interest. So this is in the legitimate interest of a data controller, but based on reasonable expectations of the data subject and provided that the processing does not override the rights of individuals. So this lawful basis is definitely appropriate for charities and third sector organisations and private organisations. Using it kind of reassures data subjects that there are compelling reasons for processing their personal data, and particularly for research purposes, because it has built into it it's based on reasonable expectations of processing, and the processing would not override the rights of individuals. And then the third one is consent, and this is using consent as a lawful basis for processing, which is a specific use of the word consent. And as I'll say in a minute, often people think about consent and conflate it with GDPR consent when they're thinking about consent in other ways. Within GDPR, consent needs to be specific, informed, and freely given, and indicated through a clear affirmative action. So this, again, would be appropriate for charities or third sector organisations, but it's generally a less appropriate lawful basis to use when processing for research purposes. And GDPR consent should not be confused with consent sought for ethical or other reasons, or programme participation. I imagine most participants here today will be working with voluntary individuals on a voluntary basis. They'll have consented to take part in the programme, but their consent to take part in the programme shouldn't necessarily be confused with using consent as the lawful basis for processing. So as I mentioned, you will already have been processing the participants' personal data for the purposes of providing the support to them. And it may be possible that you're able to use this lawful basis for processing for research purposes using the data lab. This obviously depends upon the initial lawful basis that you have for collecting and processing the data. So if your lawful basis is public task, if you're a local authority, then using the data for the data lab will most likely be covered by the initial lawful basis for processing. You are a public authority, you are doing work in the public good, and therefore processing data to send to the data lab would be covered under that lawful basis. If you've used legitimate interest as the lawful basis for processing programme participants' data, then again, using legitimate interest as a lawful basis for the data lab and for research and evaluation is likely to be covered. So within GDPR guidance, it's stated that further processing for statistical purposes shall not be considered to be incompatible with the initial purposes. So if you had a good reason for processing the data in the first place, if you're then undertaking further processing of it for statistical purposes, for research purposes, then that is compatible with the basis that you use for collecting the data in the first place. Now the third potential lawful basis you may have had for processing the data for the purposes of providing support is consent. So if you had used consent as the lawful basis when operating the programme, then you may need to obtain additional consent from participants for the processing for the data lab. I've used the word may there because there's lots and lots of shades of grey here, and depending upon exactly what the nature of the processing that the individuals consented to take part in.
I'm not sure it's just me, but Matthew, have you gone on mute, I think?
No, it's not just you. He has gone on mute, yeah.
Okay.
Just repeat the last 20 seconds.
Sorry, okay, somebody else must have put me on mute because I certainly didn't do anything at my end. Where consent is used as a lawful basis for processing, there's a number of criteria which need to be met for it to be appropriate consent for data processing. So it must be freely given, so individuals aren't coerced into giving their consent. It must be informed, so they must be told everything about what will happen and they're able to make a clear, informed decision. It must be unambiguous, so they have clearly given their consent, and it's not a question of did they really give it or not. It must be specific consent to the processing that has been specified, and it must be indicated by a clear affirmative action. So GDPR firmed up consent compared with the previous Data Protection Act 1998 by particularly the inclusion of the clear affirmative action criteria. So organisations could not rely on opt-out consent, it had to be opt-in consent. And where special category data are processed, so as we saw before, things like ethnic origin, health status, those more sensitive categories of data, this must be based on explicit consent, so an express statement of consent. Consent needs to be documented so that you can demonstrate that you have the consent for all of the data subjects. whose data you're processing under the lawful basis of consent. So if you have used consent as the basis for providing services to your program participants, if the original consent and privacy notices did not mention at all that data would be used for research evaluation to understand the outcomes of the program, and if it did not mention specifically that data would be shared with other organizations, potentially for that research and evaluation purposes, then it's likely that you would need to do something to ensure that the processing for the data lab would be lawful. Now, I've highlighted here, you may need to ask for consent for the new processing. So that is one way. If you approach all the program participants and requested consent for the processing for the data lab, or you may need to give individuals the ability to opt out. So you may want to set up the lawful basis for processing for data lab as in your legitimate interests, because as a provider of support activities to individuals, it's in your legitimate interest to understand how well they're working, for you to improve them and ensure that the participants you work with are gaining the most from participation in the program. So you may be able to set up legitimate interest as a lawful basis for the data lab, but because that's a new processing that individuals wouldn't be expecting, you would need to give them the ability to opt out. So consent under GDPR needs to be opt-in. But if you were using legitimate interests, you would need to contact program participants, but you could use opt-out. This is my understanding. You could use opt-out consent for them to participate in the evaluation, but that the lawful basis for processing in the evaluation would be legitimate interests. So in that case, they're having an opt-out of not participating in the evaluation, but the processing for the evaluation would be under your legitimate interests. So in terms of moving forwards, obviously, with an understanding of the data lab, you can set up lawful basis of processing for program participation to ensure that that covers anticipated future use of the data lab. So future processing could be under legitimate interests if it wasn't previously, and privacy notices updated to specifically mention sharing with DWP for research and for evaluation purposes. So those are some of the issues that are important that need to be taken into account by organisations when using the data lab. Now it's a very complex area, and there's a lot of interpretation available as to specific circumstances. So it's very difficult to give as a sort of informed expert support for fellow researchers. It's very difficult for me to be able to give definitive answers one way or another. Now, the Information Commissioner's Office is the independent body set up to uphold information rights. So although they're there to uphold information rights, it's important to view them not as an organisation that's going to come down on you like a ton of bricks if you've done something wrong inadvertently or have failed to take into account something that you should have. They do provide a lot of support and a lot of guidance and assistance so that organisations can understand their data protection obligations within their specific circumstances, their ways of working, the data they're processing, the individuals whose data they are processing. And so just to say, many of the participating organisations here today may be set up for data sharing under existing ways of working, and that you're perfectly able under your current lawful basis and the current privacy notices you've given to data subjects to send personal data to the data lab for the purposes of undertaking an evaluation of the effectiveness of your programme. Where you have any questions, the ICO are on hand to provide information and guidance on compliance and ensuring that personal information of the people you've worked with is protected and carried out in accordance with the legislation. So I've just listed here some of the available support from the ICO. So a lot of it's online. They have a lawful basis interactive guidance tool where you can answer a number of questions about the processing that you're going to be doing, the nature of your organisation, the nature of the individuals whose data you're processing, and it will suggest what is the appropriate lawful basis. They have a lot of resources on their website specifically for organisations, as well as information specifically for individuals. They have a live chat advice service specifically for organisations, where advisors will have, particular focus and awareness of the issues affecting organisations as opposed to affecting individuals. There's an ICO telephone helpline, and again, I think there are advisors set up specifically for organisations or for individuals. And there is also an SME web hub within the ICO website, which is aimed at small charities as well as other small and medium-sized enterprises. So there's a couple of links there to the general information and advice, and to particular Get Support section of the SME web hub. So I hope that's been informative, and be happy to obviously respond to any questions on the material. But as I say, it may be the case that I wouldn't be able to give firm advice, depending upon the specific circumstances of your organisations. It may be the case that we wouldn't have the opportunity and time here to go into the specific details really to give a definitive answer to the questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Matthew. I can see questions in the chat, but they seem to be questions for the Data Lab team at the moment. So if anybody wants, so does somebody from that team want to pick up? And I can see that Gareth, I think, and Luke have been answering. Sorry, Graham and Luke. Is there anything you want to pick up, or does anybody want to raise a hand to ask Matthew anything?
There's a question from Nasser, if I've got that pronounced right, apologies if I haven't, which I think is maybe more for Matthew. Do employers need to give consent if their employee details are shared?
It's difficult to fully understand the context there. You, as a provider of employment-related support, will have collected data on the individuals that you're working with, I imagine, and then you would have a lawful basis for processing those data for the purposes of providing support, unless employers just send employees to you without you actually processing information. I mean, if it's in that situation, I think that's a slightly unusual circumstance, and if you weren't already holding the data but wanted to use the data lab to find out what's been happening with the individuals that you have worked with, even though you haven't been holding their personal details and must have been working with them in a sort of anonymous arm's length way, then in that case the employer would be the data controller of the data subject's details, and it would be appropriate for them to share. But that does sound like an unusual way of working.
Thanks. I hadn't quite grasped the question either, but now you've addressed it. It makes sense. And I think for us in DWP, we receive information from HMRC on employees / employers. So obviously we get P14 information from HMRC, which is the equivalent of an individual's P60. Liz, can you just wave if you can hear me? It seemed to freeze there. Yeah, great. And yes, we don't need employers' consent to receive that information from HMRC, because we receive it for DWP functions. So in the same sense, from a government organisation, we wouldn't need that. We wouldn't need any additional consent from employers to receive that information. So hopefully that sort of addresses that question. If it doesn't, then by all means re-clarify and we can pick it up again. Luke's addressed the question to an extent around, can the data lab team share an explanation of how data will be used? And he said yes, drop an email. I think what we're also looking to do is to provide some standard framework. What organisations have certainly in DWP for sharing data with other government departments, for example, is we would set up data sharing agreements. What we're not proposing to do is to set up data sharing agreements with yourselves, partly because it wouldn't be a formal sort of agreement in that way, shape or form. But what we're looking to do is to take a lot of the useful information out of a data sharing agreement and make that available as a sort of, this is the service we're offering. So that would cover things like data retention, data destruction, freedom of information requests, or subject access requests and things like that. So basically all the whys, wherefores, how the process is going to work, what we're doing with your data, how the data is going to be stored, protected, accessed, etc. So again, I think that's our long-term aim. But in the meantime, Luke's said that he can pick that up. While I've been talking, Matthew, I don't know if you've had a chance to read that question, because I haven't, and want to address it.
Sorry, is this NASA's follow-up information?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a situation which is slightly unusual. It would depend upon whether your organisation is considered a data processor of the information about disabled employees, or whether you're a data controller. So if you're only a processor, then the sharing with the data lab would need to be undertaken by the data controller, or you are controller, okay, in which case, in that situation, then I don't think you'd need the employer's permission, because you have become a data controller for the purposes of providing the support to the disabled employees. And then you, as a controller, are wanting to undertake an evaluation of those services to ensure that you're offering the best support you can. So if you are a controller, if you're named as a controller for the data that you hold on disabled employees who are employed by other organisations, you're still the controller there, and you can specify the purposes of the processing that you do with the data. But I would just just check with the ICO, give them a ring and describe that situation. But if you have controller status, then in my understanding is you would not need to go back to the employers of the people you're working with, because you become a controller for the purposes of providing the support, and you're able to evaluate that as long as you're identifying the lawful basis appropriately for the evaluation, processing, and informing individuals appropriately.
From a DWP perspective, just to add, it might not help clarify, it may. When we receive data from other government departments and we assume data controllership, we would still always check in with whoever we've received data from, or look back to the original agreement under which we received that data. So we may receive data from HMRC which says DWP is going to take data controllership status, but you're not allowed to onward share it. So we would always check back in. Now, in this instance, it depends whether you've received data as a data share, or you're just acting on behalf of that employer and not collecting your own admin data. So it may not be as easy for you to check in with the employers, because it may be multiple, but just something to consider as well, if necessary. What was the agreement under which you've received any data, if you are a data controller, and whether that prevents you onward sharing it.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any further questions? I can see neither hands or anything new in the chat, so I think we've probably covered everything this morning. Thanks to the team at the DWP, thanks to Matthew from IES, that's been really, really informative. And just to remind people, the session's been recorded. ERSA will put it on the website, we'll share it with members, we'll share the slides, and we will be producing a question and answer log. Okay. All right, so that's it. Thank you. Have a good week. There's other ERSA forums and events. We've got the Youth Hubs event. We've got a Kickstart forum. Please join us as the week goes on. Okay, thank you.